You are listening to a podcast episode from the audiobook edition of The Discovery of India, produced by Giribala Joshi using advanced text-to-speech technology.
Chapter 6, New Problems. Part 1, The Arabs and the Mongols. While Shah was reigning over a powerful kingdom in North India, and Sun Song, the Chinese scholar pilgrim, was studying at Nalanda University, Islam was taking shape in Arabia. Islam was to come to India both as a religious and a political force, and create many new problems, but it is well to remember that it took a long time before it made much difference to the Indian scene. It was nearly 600 years before it reached the heart of India, and when it came to the accompaniment of political conquest, it had already changed much, and its standard-bearers were different. The Arabs who, in a fine frenzy of enthusiasm, and with a dynamic energy, had spread out and conquered from Spain to the borders of Mongolia, carrying with them a brilliant culture, did not come to India proper. They stopped at its northwestern fringe, and remained there. Arab civilization gradually decayed, and various Turkish tribes came into prominence in Central and Western Asia. It was these Turkish and Afghans from the Indian borderland who brought Islam as a political force to India. Some dates might help to bring these facts home to us. Islam may be said to begin with the Hijrat, the departure of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, in 622 AC. Muhammad died 10 years later. Some time was spent in consolidating the position in Arabia, and then those astounding series of events took place, which carried the Arabs, with the banner of Islam, right across Central Asia in the east, and across the whole North African continent to Spain and France in the west. In the 7th century, and by the beginning of the 8th, they had spread over Iraq, Iran, and Central Asia. In 712 AC, they reached and occupied Sindh in the northwest of India, and stopped there. A great desert separated this area from the more fertile parts of India. In the west, the Arabs crossed the narrow straits between Africa and Europe, since called the Straits of Gibraltar, and entered Spain in 711 AC. They occupied the whole of Spain, and crossed the Pyrenees into France. In 732 they were defeated, and checked by Charles Martel at Tours in France. This triumphant career of a people, whose homelands were the deserts of Arabia, and who had thus far played no notable part in history, is most remarkable. They must have derived their vast energy from the dynamic and revolutionary character of their prophet, and his message of human brotherhood. And yet it is wrong to imagine that Arab civilization suddenly rose out of oblivion, and took shape after the advent of Islam. There has been a tendency on the part of Islamic scholars to decry the pre-Islamic past of the Arab people, and to refer to it as the period of Jahiliyat, a kind of dark age of ignorance and superstition. Arab civilization, like others, had a long past, intimately connected with the development of the Semitic race, the Phoenicians, Cretans, Chaldeans, Hebrews. The Israelites became more exclusive, and separated themselves from the more Catholic Chaldeans and others. Between them and other Semitic races, there were conflicts. Nevertheless, all over the Semitic area there were contacts and interchanges, and to some extent a common background. Pre-Islamic Arab civilization grew up especially in Yemen. Arabic was a highly developed language at the time of the Prophet, with a mixture of Persian, and even some Indian words. Like the Phoenicians, the Arabs went far across the seas in search of trade. There was an Arab colony in South China, near Canton, in pre-Islamic days. Nevertheless, it is true that the Prophet of Islam vitalized his people, and filled them with faith and enthusiasm. Considering themselves the standard-bearers of a new cause, they developed the zeal and self-confidence, which sometimes fills a whole people, and changes history. Their success was also undoubtedly due to the decay of the states in Western and Central Asia, and in North Africa. North Africa was torn by internecine conflicts between rival Christian factions, leading often to bloody struggles for mastery. The Christianity that was practiced there at the time was narrow and intolerant, and the contrast between this and the general toleration of the Muslim Arabs with their message of human brotherhood was marked. It was this that brought whole peoples, weary of Christian strife, to their side. The culture that the Arabs carried with them to distant countries was itself continuously changing and developing. It bore the strong impress of the new ideas of Islam, and yet to call it Islamic civilization is confusing, and probably incorrect. With their capital at Damascus, they soon left their simple ways of living, and developed a more sophisticated culture. That period might be called one of Arab-Syrian civilization. Byzantine influences came to them, but most of all, when they moved to Baghdad, the traditions of old Iran affected them, and they developed the Arab-Persian civilization, which became dominant over all the vast areas they controlled. Widespread, and apparently easy, as the Arab conquests were, they did not go far beyond Sind in India, then, or later. Was this due to the fact that India was still strong enough to resist effectively the invader? Probably so, for it is difficult to explain otherwise, the lapse of several centuries before a real invasion took place. Partly, it may have been due to the internal troubles of the Arabs. Sind fell away from the central authority at Baghdad, and became a small independent Muslim state. But though there was no invasion, contacts between India and the Arab world grew, travelers came to and from, embassies were exchanged, Indian books, especially on mathematics and astronomy, were taken to Baghdad, and were translated into Arabic. Many Indian physicians went to Baghdad. These trade and cultural relations were not confined to North India. The southern states of India also participated in them, especially the Rashtrakutas, on the west coast of India, for purposes of trade. This frequent intercourse inevitably led to Indians getting to know the new religion, Islam. Missionaries also came to spread this new faith, and they were welcomed. Mosques were built. There was no objection raised either by the state or the people, nor were there any religious conflicts. It was the old tradition of India to be tolerant to all faiths and forms of worship. Thus, Islam came as a religion to India several centuries before it came as a political force. The new Arab Empire under the Umayyad Khalifa, Umayyad Caliphs, had its seat and capital at Damascus, where a splendid city grew up. But soon, about 750 AC, the Abbasid Caliphs took the capital to Baghdad. Internal conflicts followed, and Spain fell away from the Central Empire, but continued for long as an independent Arab state. Gradually the Baghdad Empire also weakened, and split up into several states, and the Seljuk Turks came from Central Asia, and became politically all-powerful at Baghdad, though the Khalifa still functioned at their pleasure. Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, a Turk, arose in Afghanistan, a great warrior and a brilliant captain, and he ignored and even taunted the Khalifa. But still Baghdad continued as the cultural center of the Islamic world, and even faraway Spain looked to it for inspiration. Europe was backward then in learning and science, and art and the amenities of life. It was Arab Spain, and especially the University of Córdoba, that kept the lamp of learning and intellectual curiosity burning throughout those dark ages of Europe, and some of its light pierced the European gloom. The Crusades beginning in 1095 AC, went on for over a century and a half. These did not merely represent a struggle between two aggressive religions, a conflict between the cross and the crescent. The Crusades, says Professor G. M. Trevelyan, the eminent historian, were the military and religious aspect of a general urge towards the East on the part of the reviving energies of Europe. The prize that Europe brought back from the Crusades was not the permanent liberation of the Holy Sepulchre, or the potential unity of Christendom, of which the story of the Crusades was one long negation. She brought back instead the finer arts and crafts, luxury, science, and intellectual curiosity, everything that Peter the Hermit would most have despised. Before the last of the Crusades had ingloriously petered out, something cyclonic and cataclysmic had taken place in the heart of Asia. Chengiz, or Genghis, Khan had begun his devastating march westward. Born in Mongolia in 1155 AC, he started on this great march, which was to convert Central Asia into a heap of smoking ruins in 1219. He was no youngster then. Bukhara, Samarkand, Herat, and Balkh, all great cities, each having more than 1 million inhabitants, were reduced to ashes. Chengiz went on to Kiev in Russia, and then returned. Baghdad somehow escaped as it did not lie on his route. He died in 1227 at the age of 72. His successors went further into Europe, and in 1258, Halaku captured Baghdad and put an end to that famous center of art and learning, where for over 500 years treasures from all parts of the world had come and accumulated. That gave a great shock to the distinctive Arab-Persian civilization in Asia. Though this survived even under the Mongols, it continued especially in parts of North Africa and especially in Spain. Crowds of scholars with their books fled from Baghdad to Cairo and Spain, and a renaissance of art and learning took place there. But Spain itself was slipping from the Arab grasp, and Córdoba had fallen in 1236 AC. For another 2 centuries and a half the kingdom of Granada continued as a bright center of Arab culture. In 1492 AC, Granada also fell to Ferdinand and Isabella, and Arab dominion in Spain ended. Thenceforward Cairo became the chief Arab center, though it came under Turkish domination. The Ottoman Turks had captured Constantinople in 1453, thereby releasing those forces, which gave birth to the European Renaissance. The Mongol conquests in Asia and Europe represented something new in the art of warfare. In scale and in quality, says Little Hart, in surprise and in mobility, in the strategic and in the tactical indirect approach, there, the Mongols' campaigns surpass any in history. Chengiz Khan was undoubtedly one of the greatest, if not the greatest, military leaders that the world has produced. The chivalry of Asia and Europe was matchwood before him and his brilliant successors, and it was pure chance that Central and Western Europe escaped conquest. From these Mongols, Europe learnt new lessons in strategy and the art of warfare. The use of gunpowder also came to Europe, through these Mongols, from China. The Mongols did not come to India. They stopped at the Indus River, and pursued their conquests elsewhere. When their great empires faded away, a number of smaller states rose in Asia, and then in 1369 Timur, a Turk, claiming to be a descendant of Chengiz Khan through his mother, tried to repeat the exploits of Chengiz. Samarkand, his capital, again became a seat of empire, brief-lived though this was. After Timur's death, his successors were more interested in a quiet life, and in cultivating the arts than in military exploits. A Timurid Renaissance, as it is called, took place in Central Asia, and it was in this environment that Babur, a descendant of Timur, was born and grew up. Babur was the founder of the Mughal dynasty in India. He was the first of the Grand Mughals. He captured Delhi in 1526. Chengiz Khan was not a Muslim, as some people seem to imagine because of his name, which is now associated with Islam. He is said to have believed in shamanism, a religion of the sky. What this was, I do not know, but the word inevitably makes one think of the Arab word for Buddhists, samani, which was derived from the Sanskrit shravan. Debased forms of Buddhism flourished then in various parts of Asia, including Mongolia, and it is probable that Chengiz grew up under their influence. It is odd to think that the greatest military conqueror in history was probably some kind of a Buddhist. Footnote: a kind of shamanism or shamaism still lingers in Arctic Siberia, Mongolia, and in Tana Tuva in Soviet Central Asia. This appears to be based entirely on a belief in spirits, and has apparently no connection whatever with Buddhism. Yet it may have been influenced long ago by some degraded forms of Buddhism, which were gradually submerged in local primitive superstitions. Tibet, which is patently a Buddhist country, has developed its own variety of Buddhism called Lamaism. Mongolia with its shamanism has also the living Buddha tradition. Thus there seem to be various gradations in northern and central Asia of Buddhism, fading off into primitive beliefs. End of footnote. In Central Asia, even today 4 legendary figures of great conquerors are remembered: Sikandar, Alexander, Sultan Mahmud, Chengiz Khan, and Timur. To these 4, must be added now a 5th, another type of person, not a warrior, but a conqueror in a different realm, round whose name legend has already gathered, Lenin. End of Part 1, titled, The Arabs and the Mongols, of Chapter 6. Part 2, The Flowering of Arab Culture and Contacts with India. Having rapidly conquered large parts of Asia, Africa, and a bit of Europe, the Arabs turned their minds to conquests in other fields. The empire was being consolidated, many new countries had come within their ken, and they were eager to find out about this world and its ways. The intellectual curiosity, the adventures in rationalist speculation, the spirit of scientific inquiry among the Arabs of the 8th and 9th centuries are very striking. Normally, in the early days of a religion based on fixed concepts and beliefs, faith is dominant, and variations are not approved or encouraged. That faith had carried the Arabs far, and that triumphant success itself must have deepened that faith. And yet, we find them going beyond the limits of dogma and creed, dabbling with agnosticism, and turning their zeal and energy towards adventures of the mind. Arab travelers, among the greatest of their kind, go to far countries to find out what other peoples were doing and thinking, to study and understand their philosophies and sciences and ways of life, and then to develop their own thought. Scholars and books from abroad were brought to Baghdad, and the Caliph, Mansud, in middle 8th century, established a research and translation bureau where translations were made from Greek, Syriac, Zend, Latin, and Sanskrit. Old monasteries in Syria, Asia Minor, and the Levant were ransacked for manuscripts. The old Alexandrian schools had been closed by Christian bishops and their scholars had been driven out. Many of these exiles had drifted to Persia and elsewhere. They now found a welcome and a safe haven in Baghdad, and they brought Greek philosophy and science and mathematics with them, Plato and Aristotle, Ptolemy and Euclid. There were Nestorian and Jewish scholars, and Indian physicians, philosophers and mathematicians. All this continued and developed during the reigns of the caliphs, Harun al-Rashid, and al-Mamun, in 8th and 9th centuries, and Baghdad became the biggest intellectual center of the civilized world. There were many contacts with India during this period, and the Arabs learnt much of Indian mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. And yet, it would appear that the initiative for all these contacts came chiefly from the Arabs, and though the Arabs learned much from India, the Indians did not learn much from the Arabs. The Indians remained aloof, wrapped up in their own conceits, and keeping as far as possible within their own shells. This was unfortunate, for the intellectual ferment of Baghdad and the Arab Renaissance movement would have shaken up the Indian mind, just when it was losing much of its creative vigor. In that spirit of intellectual inquiry, the Indians of an older days would have found kinship in thought. The study of Indian learning and science in Baghdad was greatly encouraged by the powerful Barmak family, the Barmecides, which gave viziers to Harun al-Rashid. This family had probably been converted from Buddhism. During an illness of Harun al-Rashid, a physician named Nanak was sent for from India. Nanak settled down in Baghdad, and was appointed the head of a large hospital there. Arab writers mention 6 other Indian physicians living in Baghdad at the time, besides Nanak. In astronomy, the Arabs improved on both the Indians and the Alexandrians, and 2 famous names stand out: Al-Khwarizmi, a mathematician and astronomer of the 9th century, and the poet-astronomer Omar Khayyam of the 12th century. In medicine, Arab physicians and surgeons were famous in Asia and Europe. Most famous of them was Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, of Bukhara, who was called the Prince of Physicians. He died in 1037 AC. One of the great Arab thinkers and philosophers was Abu Nasr Farabi. In philosophy, the influence of India does not seem to have been marked. Both for philosophy and science the Arabs looked to Greece and the old Alexandrian schools. Plato, and more especially, Aristotle exercised a powerful influence on the Arab mind, and since then, and up to the present day, they have become more in Arabic commentaries than in the original versions, standard subjects for study in Islamic schools. Neoplatonism from Alexandria also influenced the Arab mind. The materialist school of Greek philosophy reached the Arabs, and led to the rise of rationalism and materialism. The rationalists tried to interpret religious tenets and injunctions in terms of reason. The materialists almost rejected religion altogether. What is noteworthy is the full freedom of discussion allowed in Baghdad for all these rival and conflicting theories. This controversy and conflict between faith and reason spread from Baghdad all over the Arab world, and reached Spain. The nature of God was discussed, and it was stated that he cannot have any qualities, such as were commonly attributed to him. These qualities were human. To call God benevolent or righteous was, it was suggested, just as pagan and degraded as to say that he has a beard. Rationalism led to agnosticism and skepticism. Gradually, with the decline of Baghdad and the growth of the Turkish power, this spirit of rationalist inquiry lessened. But in Arab Spain, it still continued, and one of the most famous of Arab philosophers in Spain went to the limits of irreligion. This was Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, who lived in the 12th century. He is reported to have said of the various religions of his time that they were meant for children or for fools, or they could not be acted upon. Whether he actually said so or not is doubtful, but even the tradition shows the kind of man he was, and he suffered for his opinions. In many ways he was remarkable. He wrote strongly in favor of giving women a chance to play a part in public activities, and held that they were fully capable of justifying themselves. He also suggested that incurables, and such like persons, should be liquidated as they were a burden on society. Spain was then far in advance of the other centers of European learning, and Arab and Jewish scholars from Córdoba were greatly respected in Paris and elsewhere. These Arabs evidently had no high opinion of the other Europeans. An Arab writer named Cid, of Toledo, described the Europeans living north of the Pyrenees thus: "They are of a cold temperament and never reach maturity. They are of a great stature and of a white color. But they lack all sharpness of wit and penetration of intellect." The flowering of Arab culture and civilization in Western and Central Asia derived its inspiration from 2 main sources, Arab and Iranian. The two mixed inextricably, producing a vigor of thought as well as a high standard of living conditions for the upper classes. From the Arabs came the vigor and the spirit of inquiry, from the Iranians, the graces of life, art, and luxury. As Baghdad waned under Turkish domination, the spirit of rationalism and inquiry also declined. Chinggis Khan and the Mongols put an end to all this. 100 years later Central Asia woke up again, and Samarkand and Herat became centers for painting and architecture, reviving somewhat the old traditions of Arab-Persian civilization. But there was no revival of Arab rationalism and interest in science. Islam had become a more rigid faith suited more to military conquest rather than the conquests of the mind. Its chief representatives in Asia were no longer the Arabs, but the Turks and the Mongols, later called Mughals in India, and to some extent the Afghans. Footnote: I have often used the word Turk or Turkey. This may confuse, as Turk is associated now with the people of Turkey, who are descended from the Osmanli, or Ottoman Turks. But there were other kinds of Turks also, Seljuks, etc. All the Turanian races of Central Asia, Chinese Turkestan, etc., may be called Turks or Turkis. End of footnote. These Mongols in Western Asia had become Muslims. In the Far East and in the Middle regions many took to Buddhism. End of Part 2, titled, The Flowering of Arab Culture and Contacts with India, of Chapter 6. Part 3, Mahmud of Ghazni, and the Afghans. Early in the 8th century, in 712, the Arabs had reached Sind and occupied it. They stopped there. Even Sind fell away from the Arab Empire within half a century or so, though it continued as a small independent Muslim state. For nearly 300 years, there was no further invasion of or incursion into India. About 1000 AC, Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, in Afghanistan, a Turk who had risen to power in Central Asia, began his raids into India. There were many such raids and they were bloody and ruthless, and on every occasion Mahmud carried away with him a vast quantity of treasure. A scholar contemporary, Al-Biruni, of Khiva, describes these raids. The Hindus became like the atoms of dust scattered in all directions, and like a tale of old in the mouths of people. Their scattered remains cherish of course the most inveterate aversion towards all Muslims. This poetic description gives us some idea of the devastation caused by Mahmud, and yet it is well to remember that Mahmud touched and despoiled only a part of North India, chiefly along the lines of his marches. The whole of Central, Eastern, and South India escaped from him completely. South India at that time and later was dominated by the powerful Chola Empire, which controlled the sea routes, and had reached as far as Srivijaya in Java and Sumatra. The Indian colonies in the eastern seas were also flourishing and strong. Sea power was shared between them and South India. But this did not save North India from a land invasion. Mahmud annexed the Punjab and Sindh to his dominions, and returned to Ghazni after each raid. He was unable to conquer Kashmir. This mountain country succeeded in checking and repulsing him. He met with a severe defeat also in the Rajputana desert regions on his way back from Somnath and Kathiawar. Footnote: there is a curious passage relating to this defeat in an old chronicle in Persian, the Tariq-e-Surat, translated by Rancho Giamargi, Bombay, 1882, page 112. Shah Mahmud took to his heels in dismay and saved his life, but many of his followers of both sexes were captured. Turk, Afghan, and Mughal female prisoners, if they happened to be virgins, were accepted as wives by the Indian soldiers. The bowels of the others, however, were cleaned by means of emetics and purgatives, and thereafter the captives were married to men of similar rank. Low females were joined to low men. Respectable men were compelled to shave off their beards, and were enrolled among the Shekhawat and the Wadal tribes of Rajputs, whilst the lower kinds were allotted to the castes of Kolis, Kantas, Babriyas, and Mers. I am not myself acquainted with the Tariq-e-Surat, and do not know how far it can be considered as reliable. I have taken this quotation from K.M. Munshi's The Glory That Was Gurjar Days, page 140. What is especially interesting is the way foreigners are said to have been absorbed into the Rajput clans and even marriages having taken place. The cleansing process mentioned is novel. End of footnote. This was his last raid, and he did not return. Mahmud was far more a warrior than a man of faith, and like many other conquerors he used and exploited the name of religion for his conquests. India was to him just a place from which he could carry off treasure and material to his homeland. He enrolled an army in India, and placed it under one of his noted generals, Tilak by name, who was an Indian and a Hindu. This army he used against his own co-religionists in Central Asia. Mahmud was anxious to make his own city of Ghazni rival the great cities of Central and Western Asia, and he carried off from India large numbers of artisans and master builders. Building interested him, and he was much impressed by the city of Mathura, modern Mathura, near Delhi. About this he wrote, "There are here 1,000 edifices as firm as the faith of the faithful, nor is it likely that this city has attained its present condition, but at the expense of many millions of dinars, nor could such another be constructed under a period of 200 years. In the intervals of his fighting, Mahmud was interested in encouraging cultural activities in his own homeland, and he gathered together a number of eminent men. Among these was the famous Persian poet Ferdowsi, author of the Shahnameh, who later fell out with Mahmud. Al-Biruni, a scholar and traveler, was a contemporary, and in his books he gives us a glimpse into other aspects of life in Central Asia then. Born near Khiva, but of Persian descent, he came to India and traveled a great deal. He tells us of the great irrigation works in the Chola kingdom in the south, though it is doubtful if he visited them himself or went to South India. He learnt Sanskrit in Kashmir and studied the religion, philosophy, science, and arts of India. He had previously learnt Greek in order to study Greek philosophy. His books are not only a storehouse of information, but tell us how, behind war and pillage and massacre, patient scholarship continued, and how the people of one country tried to understand those of another even when passion and anger had embittered their relations. That passion and anger no doubt clouded judgments on either side, and each considered his own people superior to the other. Of the Indians, Al-Biruni says that they are haughty, foolishly vain, self-contained, and stolid, and that they believe that there is no country like theirs, no nation like theirs, no kings like theirs, no science like theirs. Probably a correct enough description of the temper of the people. Mahmud's raids are a big event in Indian history, though politically India as a whole was not greatly affected by them, and the heart of India remained untouched. They demonstrated the weakness and decay of North India, and Al-Biruni's accounts throw further light on the political disintegration of the North and West. These repeated incursions from the Northwest brought many new elements into India's closed thought and economy. Above all, they brought Islam, for the first time, to the accompaniment of ruthless military conquest. So far, for over 300 years, Islam had come peacefully as a religion and taken its place among the many religions of India without trouble or conflict. The new approach produced powerful psychological reactions among the people and filled them with bitterness. There was no objection to a new religion, but there was strong objection to anything which forcibly interfered with and upset their way of life. India was, it must be remembered, a country of many religions, in spite of the dominance of the Hindu faith in its various shapes and forms. Apart from Jainism and Buddhism, which had largely faded away and been absorbed by Hinduism, there were Christianity and the Hebrew religion. Both of these had reached India probably during the 1st century after Christ, and both had found a place in the country. There were large numbers of Syrian Christians and Nestorians in South India, and they were as much part of the country as anyone else. So were the Jews. And so too was the small community of the Zoroastrians who had come to India from Iran in the 7th century. So also were many Muslims on the west coast and in the northwest. Mahmud came as a conqueror, and the Punjab became just an outlying province of his dominions. Yet when he had established himself as a ruler there, an attempt was made to tone down his previous methods in order to win over the people of the province to some extent. There was less of interference with their ways, and Hindus were appointed to high office in the army and the administration. Only the beginnings of this process are noticeable in Mahmud's time. It was to grow later. Mahmud died in 1030. More than 160 years passed after his death without any other invasion of India or an extension of Turkish rule beyond the Punjab. Then an Afghan, Shahabuddin Ghori, captured Ghazni and put an end to the Ghaznavite Empire. He marched to Lahore and then to Delhi. But the king of Delhi, Prithvi Raj Chauhan, defeated him utterly. Shahabuddin retired to Afghanistan and came back next year with another army. This time he triumphed, and in 1192 he sat on the throne of Delhi. Prithvi Raj is a popular hero, still famous in song and legend, for reckless lovers are always popular. He had carried away the girl he loved and who loved him, from the very palace of her father, Jayachandra, king of Kannauj, defying an assembled host of princelings who had come to offer court to her. He won his bride for a brief while, but at the cost of a bitter feud with a powerful ruler and the lives of the bravest on both sides. The chivalry of Delhi and central India engaged in internecine conflict, and there was much mutual slaughter. And so, all for the love of a woman, Prithvi Raj lost his life and throne, and Delhi, that seat of empire, passed into the hands of an invader from outside. But his love story is sung still and he is a hero, while Jayachandra is looked upon almost as a traitor. This conquest of Delhi did not mean the subjugation of the rest of India. The Cholas were still powerful in the south, and there were other independent states. It took another century and a half for Afghan rule to spread over the greater part of the south. But Delhi was significant and symbolic of the new order. End of Part 3, titled, Mahmud of Ghazni and the Afghans, of Chapter 6. Part 4, the Indo-Afghans, South India, Vijayanagar, Babar, Sea Power. Indian history has usually been divided by English as well as some Indian historians into three major periods, ancient or Hindu, Muslim, and the British period. This division is neither intelligent nor correct, it is deceptive, and gives a wrong perspective. It deals more with the superficial changes at the top than with the essential changes in the political, economic, and cultural development of the Indian people. The so-called ancient period is vast and full of change, of growth and decay, and then growth again. What is called the Muslim or medieval period brought another change, and an important one, and yet it was more or less confined to the top, and did not vitally affect the essential continuity of Indian life. The invaders who came to India from the northwest, like so many of their predecessors in more ancient times, became absorbed into India and part of her life. Their dynasties became Indian dynasties, and there was a great deal of racial fusion by intermarriage. A deliberate effort was made, apart from a few exceptions, not to interfere with the ways and customs of the people. They looked to India as their home country and had no other affiliations. India continued to be an independent country. The coming of the British made a vital difference, and the old system was uprooted in many ways. They brought an entirely different impulse from the West, which had slowly developed in Europe from the times of the Renaissance, Reformation, and political revolution in England, and was taking shape in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The American and French revolutions were to carry this further. The British remained outsiders, aliens and misfits in India, and made no attempt to be otherwise. Above all, for the first time in India's history, her political control was exercised from outside, and her economy was centered in a distant place. They made India a typical colony of the modern age, a subject country for the first time in her long history. Mahmud of Ghazni's invasion of India was certainly a foreign Turkish invasion, and resulted in the Punjab being separated from the rest of India for a while. The Afghans who came at the end of the 12th century were different. They were an Indo-Aryan race closely allied to the people of India. Indeed, for long stretches of time Afghanistan had been, and was destined to be, a part of India. Their language, Pashto, was basically derived from Sanskrit. There are few places in India or outside, which are so full of ancient monuments and remains of Indian culture, chiefly of the Buddhist period, as Afghanistan. More correctly, the Afghans should be called the Indo-Afghans. They differed in many ways from the people of the Indian plains, just as the people of the mountain valleys of Kashmir differed from the dwellers of the warmer and flatter regions below. But in spite of this difference, Kashmir had always been and continued to be an important seat of Indian learning and culture. The Afghans differed also from the more highly cultured and sophisticated Arabs and Persians. They were hard and fierce like their mountain fastnesses, rigid in their faith, warriors not inclined towards intellectual pursuits or adventures of the mind. They behaved to begin with as conquerors over a rebellious people and were cruel and harsh. But soon they toned down. India became their home, and Delhi was their capital, not distant Ghazni, as in Mahmud's time. Afghanistan, where they came from, was just an outlying part of their kingdom. The process of Indianization was rapid, and many of them married women of the country. One of their great rulers, Alauddin Khilji, himself married a Hindu lady, and so did his son. Some of the subsequent rulers were racially Turks, such as Qutbuddin Aibak, the Sultana Razia, and Iltutmish, but the nobility and army continued to be mainly Afghan. Delhi flourished as an imperial capital. Ibn Battuta, a famous Arab traveler from Morocco, who visited many countries and saw many cities from Cairo and Constantinople to China, described it in the 14th century, perhaps with some exaggeration, as one of the greatest cities in the universe. The Delhi Sultanate spread southwards. The Chola kingdom was declining, but in its place, a new seafaring power had grown. This was the Pandya kingdom, with its capital at Madura, and its port at Kayal on the east coast. It was a small kingdom, but a great center of trade. Marco Polo twice visited this port on his way from China, in 1288 and 1293, and described it as a great and noble city, full of ships from Arabia and China. He also mentions the very fine muslins, which look like tissues of a spider's web and which were made on the east coast of India. Marco Polo tells us also an interesting fact. Large numbers of horses were imported by sea from Arabia and Persia into South India. The climate of South India was not suited to horse breeding, and horses, apart from their other uses, were necessary for military purposes. The best breeding grounds for horses were in Central and Western Asia, and this may well explain, to some extent, the superiority of the Central Asian races in warfare. Genghis Khan's Mongols were magnificent horsemen, and were devoted to their horses. The Turks were also fine horsemen, and the love of the Arab for his horse is well known. In North and West India, there are some good breeding grounds for horses, especially in Kathiawar, and the Rajputs are very fond of their horses. Many a petty war was waged for a famous charger. There is a story of a Delhi Sultan admiring the charger of a Rajput chief and asking him for it. The Hara chief replied to the Lodi king, "There are 3 things you must not ask of a Rajput: his horse, his mistress, or his sword," and he galloped away. There was trouble afterwards. Late in the 14th century, Timur, the Turk or Turco-Mongol, came down from the north and smashed up the Delhi Sultanate. He was only a few months in India, he came to Delhi and went back. But all along his route he created a wilderness adorned with pyramids of skulls of those he had slain, and Delhi itself became a city of the dead. Fortunately, he did not go far, and only some parts of the Punjab and Delhi had to suffer this terrible affliction. It took many years for Delhi to wake up from this sleep of death, and even when it woke up it was no longer the capital of a great empire. Timur's visit had broken that empire, and out of it had arisen a number of states in the south. Long before this, early in the 14th century, 2 great states had risen, Gulbarga, called the Bahmani kingdom, and the Hindu kingdom of Vijayanagar. Footnote: the name and origin of the Bahmani kingdom of the south is interesting. The founder of this state was an Afghan Muslim who had a Hindu patron in his early days, Gungu Brahman. In gratitude to him he even took his name, and his dynasty was called the Bahmani, from Brahman, dynasty. End of footnote. Gulbarga, now split up into 5 states, one of these being Ahmednagar. Ahmed Nizam Shah, the founder of Ahmednagar in 1490, was the son of Nizam-ul-Mulk Bairi, a minister of the Bahmani kings. This Nizam-ul-Mulk was the son of a Brahmin accountant named Bairu, from which his name Bairi. Thus the Ahmednagar dynasty was of indigenous origin, and Chand Bibi, the heroine of Ahmednagar, had mixed blood. All the Muslim states in the south were indigenous and Indianized. After Timur's sack of Delhi, North India remained weak and divided up. South India was better off, and the largest and most powerful of the southern kingdoms was Vijayanagar. This state and city attracted many of the Hindu refugees from the north. From contemporary accounts it appears that the city was rich and very beautiful. The city is such that I has not seen, nor heard of any place resembling it upon the whole earth, says Abdur Razak, from Central Asia. There were arcades and magnificent galleries for the bazaars, and rising above them all was the palace of the king, surrounded by many rivulets and streams flowing through channels of cut stone, polished and even. The whole city was full of gardens, and because of them, as an Italian visitor in 1420, Nicola Conti, writes, the circumference of the city was 60 miles. A later visitor was Paes, a Portuguese who came in 1522 after having visited the Italian cities of the Renaissance. The city of Vijayanagar, he says, is as large as Rome and very beautiful to the sight. It is full of charm and wonder with its innumerable lakes and waterways and fruit gardens. It is the best provided city in the world, and everything abounds. The chambers of the palace were a mass of ivory, with roses and lotuses carved in ivory at the top. It is so rich and beautiful that you would hardly find anywhere another such. Of the ruler, Krishna Dev Rai, Paes writes, he is the most feared and perfect king that could possibly be, cheerful of disposition and very merry. He is one that seeks to honor foreigners, and receives them kindly, asking about all their affairs whatever their condition may be. While Vijayanagar was flourishing in the south, the petty Sultanate of Delhi had to meet a new foe. Yet another invader came down from the northern mountains, and on the famous battlefield of Panipat, near Delhi, where so often India's fate has been decided, he won the throne of Delhi in 1526. This was Babar, a Turco-Mongol and a prince of the Timurid line in Central Asia. With him begins the Mughal Empire of India. Babur's success was probably due not only to the weakness of the Delhi Sultanate, but to his possessing a new and improved type of artillery, which was not in use in India then. From this period onwards, India seems to lag behind in the developing science of warfare. It would be more correct to say that the whole of Asia remained where it was while Europe was advancing in this science. The great Mughal Empire, powerful as it was in India for 200 years, probably could not compete on equal terms with European armies from the 17th century onwards. But no European army could come to India unless it had control over the sea routes. The major change that was taking place during these centuries was the development of European sea power. With the fall of the Chola kingdom in the south in the 13th century, Indian sea power declined rapidly. The small Pandya state, though intimately connected with the sea, was not strong enough. The Indian colonies, however, still continued to hold command over the Indian Ocean till the 15th century, when they were ousted by the Arabs, who were soon to be followed by the Portuguese. End of Part 4, titled, The Indo-Afghans, South India, Vijayanagar, Babar, Sea Power, of Chapter 6. Part 5, Synthesis and Growth of Mixed Culture, Purdah, Kabir, Guru Nanak, Amir Khusrau. It is thus wrong and misleading to talk of a Muslim invasion of India or of the Muslim period in India, just as it would be wrong to refer to the coming of the British to India as a Christian invasion, or to call the British period in India a Christian period. Islam did not invade India, it had come to India some centuries earlier. There was a Turkish invasion, Mahmud's, and an Afghan invasion, and then a Turco-Mongol or Mughal invasion, and of these the two latter were important. The Afghans might well be considered a border Indian group, hardly strangers to India, and the period of their political dominance should be called the Indo-Afghan period. The Mughals were outsiders and strangers to India, and yet, they fitted into the Indian structure with remarkable speed and began the Indo-Mughal period. Through choice or circumstances or both, the Afghan rulers and those who had come with them, merged into India. Their dynasties became completely Indianized with their roots in India, looking upon India as their homeland, and the rest of the world as foreign. In spite of political conflict, they were generally considered as such, and many even of the Rajput princes accepted them as their overlords. But there were other Rajput chiefs who refused to submit, and there were fierce conflicts. Firoz Shah, one of the well-known sultans of Delhi, had a Hindu mother, so had Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq. Such marriages between the Afghans, Turkish, and the Hindu nobility were not frequent, but they did take place. In the south, the Muslim ruler of Gulbarga married a Hindu princess of Vijayanagar with great pomp and ceremony. It appears that in the Muslim countries of Central and Western Asia, Indians had a good reputation. As early as the 11th century, that is, before the Afghan conquest, a Muslim geographer, Idrisi, wrote, "The Indians are naturally inclined to justice, and never depart from it in their actions. Their good faith, honesty, and fidelity to their engagements are well known, and they are so famous for these qualities that people flock to their country from every side." Footnote, from Sir H. M. Eliot's History of India, Volume 1, page 88. End of footnote. An efficient administration grew up, and communications were especially improved, chiefly for military reasons. Government was more centralized now, though it took care not to interfere with local customs. Sher Shah, who intervened during the early Mughal period, was the ablest among the Afghan rulers. He laid the foundations of a revenue system which was later to be expanded by Akbar. Raja Todermal, Akbar's famous revenue minister, was first employed by Sher Shah. Hindu talent was increasingly used by the Afghan rulers. The effect of the Afghan conquest on India and Hinduism was twofold, each development contradicting the other. The immediate reaction was an exodus of people to the south, away from the areas under Afghan rule. Those who remained became more rigid and exclusive, retired into their shells, and tried to protect themselves from foreign ways and influences by hardening the caste system. On the other hand, there was a gradual and hardly conscious approach towards these foreign ways both in thought and life. A synthesis worked itself out, new styles of architecture arose, food and clothing changed, and life was affected and varied in many other ways. This synthesis was especially marked in music, which, following its old Indian classical pattern, developed in many directions. The Persian language became the official court language and many Persian words crept into popular use. At the same time the popular languages were developed. Among the unfortunate developments that took place in India was the growth of Purdah, or the seclusion of women. Why this should have been so is not clear, but somehow, it did result from the interaction of the new elements on the old. In India there had been previously some segregation of the sexes among the aristocracy, as in many other countries and notably in ancient Greece. Some such segregation existed in ancient Iran also, and to some extent all over Western Asia. But nowhere was there any strict seclusion of women. Probably this started in the Byzantine court circles where eunuchs were employed to guard the women's apartments. Byzantine influence traveled to Russia where there was a fairly strict seclusion of women right up to Peter the Great's time. This had nothing to do with the Tartars who, it is well established, did not segregate their womenfolk. The mixed Arab-Persian civilization was affected in many ways by Byzantine customs and possibly the segregation of upper-class women grew to some extent. Yet, even so, there was no strict seclusion of women in Arabia or in other parts of Western or Central Asia. The Afghans, who crowded into northern India after the capture of Delhi, had no strict purdah. Turkish and Afghan princesses and ladies of the court often went riding, hunting, and paying visits. It is an old Islamic custom, still to be observed, that women must keep their laces unveiled during the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. Purdah seems to have grown in India during Mughal times, when it became a mark of status and prestige among both Hindus and Muslims. This custom of seclusion of women spread especially among the upper classes of those areas where Muslim influence had been most marked, in the great central and eastern bloc comprising Delhi, the United Provinces, Rajputana, Bihar, and Bengal. And yet it is odd that Purdah has not been very strict in the Punjab and in the frontier province, which are predominantly Muslim. In the south and west of India there has been no such seclusion of women, except to some extent among the Muslims. I have no doubt at all that among the causes of India's decay in recent centuries, Purdah, or the seclusion of women, holds an important place. I am even more convinced that the complete ending of this barbarous custom is essential before India can have a progressive social life. That it injures women is obvious enough, but the injury to man, to the growing child who has to spend much of its time among women in Purdah, and to social life generally is equally great. Fortunately, this evil practice is fast disappearing among the Hindus, more slowly among the Muslims. The strongest factor in this liquidation of Purdah has been the Congress political and social movements, which have drawn tens of thousands of middle-class women into some kind of public activity. Gandhiji has been, and is, a fierce opponent of Purdah, and has called it a vicious and brutal custom, which has kept women backward and undeveloped. I thought of the wrong being done by men to the women of India by clinging to a barbarous custom which, whatever use it might have had when it was first introduced, had now become totally useless and was doing incalculable harm to the country. Gandhiji urged that woman should have the same liberty and opportunity of self-development as man. Good sense must govern the relations between the two sexes. There should be no barrier erected between them. Their mutual behavior should be natural and spontaneous. Gandhiji has indeed written and spoken with passion in favor of women's equality and freedom, and has bitterly condemned their domestic slavery. I have digressed and made a sudden jump to modern times, and must go back to the medieval period after the Afghans had established themselves in Delhi, and a synthesis was working itself out between old ways and new. Most of these changes took place at the top, among the nobility and upper classes, and did not affect the mass of the population, especially the rural masses. They originated in court circles and spread in the cities and urban areas. Thus began a process which was to continue for several centuries, of developing a mixed culture in North India. Delhi, and what are known now as the United Provinces, became the center of this, just as they had been, and still continued to be, the center of the old Aryan culture. But much of this Aryan culture drifted to the south, which became a stronghold of Hindu orthodoxy. After the Delhi Sultanate had weakened owing to Timur's incursion, a small Muslim state grew up in Jaunpur, in the United Provinces. Right through the 15th century this was a center of art and culture and toleration in religion. The growing popular language, Hindi, was encouraged, and an attempt was even made to bring about a synthesis between the religious faiths of the Hindus and the Muslims. About this time in far Kashmir in the north an independent Muslim king, Jain-ul-Abidin, also became famous for his toleration and his encouragement of Sanskrit learning and the old culture. All over India this new ferment was working and new ideas were troubling people's minds. As of old, India was subconsciously reacting to the new situation, trying to absorb the foreign element and herself changing somewhat in the process. Out of this ferment arose new types of reformers, who deliberately preached this synthesis and often condemned or ignored the caste system. There was the Hindu, Ramanand, in the south, in the 15th century, and his still more famous disciple Kabir, a Muslim weaver of Benares. Kabir's poems and songs became, and still are, very popular. In the north there was Guru Nanak, who is considered the founder of Sikhism. The influence of these reformers went far beyond the limits of the particular sects that grew up after them. Hinduism as a whole felt the impact of the new ideas, and Islam in India also became somewhat different from what it was elsewhere. The fierce monotheism of Islam influenced Hinduism, and the vague pantheistic attitude of the Hindu had its effect on the Indian Muslim. Most of these Indian Muslims were converts bred up in and surrounded by the old traditions, only a comparatively small number of them had come from outside. Muslim mysticism, and Sufism, which probably had its beginnings in Neoplatonism, grew. Perhaps the most significant indication of the growing absorption of the foreign element in India was its use of the popular language of the country, even though Persian continued to be the court language. There are many notable books written by the early Muslims in Hindi. The most famous of these writers was Amir Khusrau, a Turk whose family had settled in the United Provinces for 2 or 3 generations and who lived in the 14th century during the reigns of several Afghan sultans. He was a poet of the first rank in Persian, and he knew Sanskrit also. He was a great musician, and introduced many innovations in Indian music. He is also said to have invented the sitar, the popular stringed instrument of India. He wrote on many subjects, and in particular, in praise of India, enumerating the various things in which India excelled. Among these were religion, philosophy, logic, language, and grammar, Sanskrit, music, mathematics, science, and the mango fruit. But his fame in India rests, above all, on his popular songs, written in the ordinary spoken dialect of Hindi. Wisely he did not choose the literary medium which would have been understood by a small coterie only. He went to the villager not only for his language, but for his customs and ways of living. He sang of the different seasons, and each season, according to the old classical style of India, had its own appropriate tune and words. He sang of life in its various phases, of the coming of the bride, of separation from the beloved, of the rains when life springs anew from the parched earth. Those songs are still widely sung, and may be heard in any village or town in northern or central India. Especially when the rainy season begins, and in every village big swings are hung from the branches of the mango or the peepal trees, and all the village girls and boys gather together to celebrate the occasion. Amir Khusrau was the author also of innumerable riddles and conundrums which are very popular with children as well as grown-ups. Even during his long life Khusrau's songs and riddles had made him famous. That reputation has continued and grown. I do not know if there is any other instance anywhere of songs written 600 years ago maintaining their popularity and their mass appeal and being still sung without any change of words. End of Part 5, titled, Synthesis and Growth of Mixed Culture, Purdah, Kabir, Guru Nanak, Amir Khusrau, of Chapter 6. Part 6, The Indian Social Structure, Importance of the Group. Almost everyone, who knows anything at all about India, has heard of the caste system. Almost every outsider, and many people in India condemn it, or criticize it as a whole. Probably there is hardly anyone left even in India, who approves of it in all its present ramifications and developments, though there are undoubtedly many still who accept its basic theory, and large numbers of Hindus adhere to it in their lives. Some confusion arises in the use of the word caste, for different people attach different meanings to it. The average European, or an Indian who is allied to him in thought and approach, thinks of it as just a petrification of classes, an ingenious method to preserve a certain hierarchy of classes, to keep the upper classes permanently at the top, and the lower ones permanently at the bottom of the scale. There is truth in that, and in its origin it was probably a device to keep the Aryan conquerors apart from, and above, the conquered peoples. Undoubtedly, in its growth it has acted in that way, though originally there may have been a good deal of flexibility about it. Yet that is only a part of the truth, and it does not explain its power, and cohesiveness, and the way it has lasted down to our present day. It survived not only the powerful impact of Buddhism and many centuries of Afghan and Mughal rule and the spread of Islam, but also the strenuous efforts of innumerable Hindu reformers, who raised their voices against it. It is only today that it is seriously threatened, and its very basis has been attacked. That is not chiefly because of some powerful urge to reform itself, which has arisen in Hindu society, though such urge is undoubtedly present, nor is it because of ideas from the West, though such ideas have certainly exerted their influence. The change that is taking place before our eyes is due essentially to basic economic changes, which have shaken up the whole fabric of Indian society, and are likely to upset it completely. Conditions of life have changed, and thought patterns are changing so much that it seems impossible for the caste system to endure. What will take its place is more than I can say, for something much more than the caste system is at stake. The conflict is between two approaches to the problem of social organization, which are diametrically opposed to each other: the old Hindu conception of the group being the basic unit of organization, and the excessive individualism of the West, emphasizing the individual above the group. That conflict is not of India only, it is of the West also, and of the entire world, though it takes different forms there. The 19th century civilization of Europe, taking shape in democratic liberalism and its extensions in the economic and social fields, represented the high-water mark of that individualism. That 19th century ideology with its social and political organization has extended itself and flowed into the 20th century, but it seems wholly out of date now, and is cracking under stress of crisis and war. The importance of the group and the community is emphasized more now, and the problem is to reconcile the respective claims of the individual and the group. The solution of that problem may take different forms in different countries, yet there will be an ever-increasing tendency for one basic solution to apply to all. The caste system does not stand by itself, it is a part, and an integral part, of a much larger scheme of social organization. It may be possible to remove some of its obvious abuses and to lessen its rigidity, and yet to leave the system intact. But that is highly unlikely, as the social and economic forces at play are not much concerned with this superstructure. They are attacking it at the base and undermining the other supports, which held it up. Indeed, great parts of these are already gone, or are rapidly going, and more the caste system is left stranded by itself. It has ceased to be a question of whether we like caste or dislike it. Changes are taking place in spite of our likes and dislikes. But it is certainly in our power to mold those changes and direct them, so that we can take full advantage of the character and genius of the Indian people as a whole, which have been so evident in the cohesiveness and stability of the social organization they built up. Sir George Birdwood has said somewhere, "So long as the Hindus hold to the caste system, India will be India, but from the day they break from it, there will be no more India. That glorious peninsula will be degraded to the position of a bitter east end of the Anglo-Saxon Empire. With caste or without it, we have long been degraded to that position in the British Empire, and, in any event, whatever our future position is likely to be, it will not be confined within the bounds of that empire." But there is some truth in what Sir George Birdwood said, though probably he did not look at it from this point of view. The breakup of a huge and long-standing social organization may well lead to a complete disruption of social life, resulting in absence of cohesion, mass suffering and the development on a vast scale of abnormalities in individual behavior, unless some other social structure, more suited to the times and to the genius of the people, takes its place. Perhaps disruption is inevitable during the transition period. There is enough of this disruption all over the world today. Perhaps it is only through the pain and suffering that accompany such disruption that a people grow and learn the lessons of life, and adapt themselves anew to changing conditions. Nevertheless, we cannot just disrupt and hope for something better, without having some vision of the future we are working for, however vague that vision may be. We cannot just create a vacuum, or else that vacuum will fill itself up in a way that we may have to deplore. In the constructive schemes that we may make, we have to pay attention to the human material we have to deal with, to the background of its thought and urges, and to the environment in which we have to function. To ignore all this and to fashion some idealistic scheme in the air, or merely to think in terms of imitating what others have done elsewhere, would be folly. It becomes desirable therefore to examine and understand the old Indian social structure, which has so powerfully influenced our people. This structure was based on three concepts: the autonomous village community, caste, and the joint family system. In all these three it is the group that counts, the individual has a secondary place. There is nothing very unique about all this separately, and it is easy to find something equivalent to any of these three in other countries, especially in medieval times. Like the old Indian republics, there were primitive republics elsewhere. There was also a kind of primitive communism. The old Russian mir might be comparable in some way to the Indian village community. Caste has been essentially functional and similar to the medieval trade guilds of Europe. The Chinese family system bears a strong resemblance to the Hindu joint family. I do not know enough of all these to carry the comparison far, and, in any case, it is not important for my purpose. Taken as a whole, the entire Indian structure was certainly unique, and as it developed, it became more so. End of Part 6, titled, The Indian Social Structure, Importance of the Group, of Chapter 6. Part 7, Village Self-Government, the Shukra Nitisara. There is an old book of the 10th century, which gives us some idea of Indian polity as it was conceived prior to the Turkish and Afghan invasions. This is the Nitisara, the Science of Polity, by Shukracharya. It deals with the organization of the central government, as well as of town and village life, of the King's Council of State, and various departments of government. The village panchayat or elected council has large powers, both executive and judicial, and its members were treated with the greatest respect by the king's officers. Land was distributed by this panchayat, which also collected taxes out of the produce, and paid the government's share on behalf of the village. Over a number of these village councils there was a larger panchayat or council to supervise and interfere if necessary. Some old inscriptions further tell us how the members of the village councils were elected, and what their qualifications and disqualifications were. Various committees were formed, elected annually, and women could serve on them. In case of misbehavior, a member could be removed. A member could be disqualified if he failed to render accounts of public funds. An interesting rule to prevent nepotism is mentioned: near relatives of members were not to be appointed to public office. These village councils were very jealous of their liberties, and it was laid down that no soldier could enter the village unless he had a royal permit. If the people complained of an official, the Nitisara says that the king should take the side, not of his officers, but of his subjects. If many complained, then the official was to be dismissed, for who does not get intoxicated by drinking of the vanity of office? The king was to act in accordance with the opinion of the majority of the people. Public opinion is more powerful than the king, as the rope made of many fibers is strong enough to drag a lion. In making official appointments work, character and merit are to be regarded, neither caste nor family, and neither through color, nor through ancestors can the spirit worthy of a Brahmin be generated. In the larger towns, there were many artisans and merchants, and craft guilds, mercantile associations, and banking corporations were formed. Each of these controlled its own domestic affairs. All this information is very fragmentary, but it does appear from this and many other sources that there was a widespread system of self-government in towns and villages, and the central government seldom interfered, so long as its quota of taxes was paid. Customary law was strong, and the political or military power seldom interfered with rights based on custom. Originally, the agrarian system was based on a cooperative or collective village. Individuals and families had certain rights as well as certain obligations, both of which were determined and protected by customary law. There was no theocratic monarchy in India. In Indian polity, if the king is unjust or tyrannical, the right to rebel against him is admitted. What the Chinese philosopher, Mencius, said 2,000 years ago, might apply to India: when a ruler treats his subjects like grass and dirt, then subjects should treat him as a bandit and an enemy. The whole conception of monarchical power differed from that of European feudalism, where the king had authority over all persons and things in his domain. This authority he delegated to lords and barons, who vowed allegiance to him. Thus a hierarchy of authority was built up. Both the land and the people connected with it belonged to the feudal lord, and through him, to the king. This was the development of the Roman conception of dominium. In India, there was nothing of this kind. The king had the right to collect certain taxes from the land, and this revenue-collecting power was all he could delegate to others. The peasant in India was not the lord's serf. There was plenty of land available, and there was no advantage in dispossessing the peasant. Thus, in India, there was no landlord system, as known in the West, nor was the individual peasant the full owner of his patch of land. Both these concepts were introduced much later by the British with disastrous results. Foreign conquests brought war and destruction, revolts and their ruthless suppression, and new ruling classes relying chiefly on armed force. This ruling class could often ignore the numerous constitutional restraints, which had always been part of the customary law of the country. Important consequences followed, and the power of the self-governing village communities decreased, and later various changes were introduced in the land revenue system. Nevertheless, the Afghan and Mughal rulers took special care not to interfere with old customs and conventions, and no fundamental changes were introduced, and the economic and social structure of Indian life continued as before. Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq issued definite instructions to his officials to preserve customary law, and to keep the affairs of the state apart from religion, which was a personal matter of individual preference. But changing times and conflicts, as well as the increasing centralization of government, slowly but progressively lessened the respect given to customary law. The village self-governing community, however, continued. Its breakup began only under British rule. End of Part 7, titled, Village Self-Government, the Shukra Nitisara, of Chapter 6. Part 8, The Theory and Practice of Caste, the Joint Family. In India, says Havel, religion is hardly a dogma, but a working hypothesis of human conduct adapted to different stages of spiritual development and different conditions of life. In the ancient days, when Indo-Aryan culture first took shape, religion had to provide for the needs of men, who were as far removed from each other in civilization and intellectual and spiritual development as it is possible to conceive. There were primitive forest dwellers, fetishists, totem worshippers, and believers in every kind of superstition, and there were those who had attained the highest flights of spiritual thought. In between, there was every shade and gradation of belief and practice. While the highest forms of thought were pursued by some, these were wholly beyond the reach of many. As social life grew, certain uniformities of belief spread, but, even so, many differences, cultural and temperamental, remained. The Indo-Aryan approach was to avoid the forcible suppression of any belief, or the destruction of any claim. Each group was left free to work out its ideals along the plane of its mental development and understanding. Assimilation was attempted, but there was no denial or suppression. A similar and even more difficult problem had to be faced in social organization. How to combine these utterly different groups in one social system, each group cooperating with the whole and yet retaining its own freedom to live its own life and develop itself. In a sense, though the comparison is far-fetched, this may be compared to the numerous minority problems of today, which afflict so many countries and are still far from solution. The United States of America solve their minority problems, more or less, by trying to make every citizen a 100% American. They make everyone conform to a certain type. Other countries, with a longer and more complicated past, are not so favorably situated. Even Canada has its strong race, religion, and language-conscious French group. In Europe the barriers are higher and deeper. And yet all this applies to Europeans, or those who have spread from Europe, people who have a certain common background and similarity of culture. Where non-Europeans come in, they do not fit this pattern. In the United States, Negroes, though they may be 100% American, are a race apart, deprived of many opportunities and privileges, which others have as a matter of course. There are innumerable worse examples elsewhere. Only Soviet Russia is said to have solved its problem of nationalities and minorities by creating what is called a multinational state. If these difficulties and problems pursue us even today with all our knowledge and progress, how much harder they must have been in the ancient days when the Indo-Aryans were evolving their civilization and social structure in a land full of variety and different types of human beings. The normal way to deal with these problems then, and later, was to exterminate or enslave the conquered populations. This way was not followed in India, but it is clear that every precaution was taken to perpetuate the superior position of the upper groups. Having ensured that superiority, a kind of multiple community state was built up, in which, within certain limits and subject to some general rules, freedom was given to each group to follow its avocation, and live its own life in accordance with its own customs or desires. The only real restriction was that it must not interfere or come into conflict with another group. This was a flexible and expanding system, for new groups could always be formed either by newcomers or by dissident members of an old group, provided they were numerous enough to do so. Within each group there was equality and democracy, and the elected leaders guided it, and frequently consulted the entire group whenever any important question arose. These groups were almost always functional, each specializing in a particular trade or craft. They became thus, some kind of trade unions or craft guilds. There was a strong sense of solidarity within each, which not only protected the group, but sheltered and helped an individual member who got into trouble or was in economic distress. The functions of each group or caste were related to the functions of other castes, and the idea was that if each group functioned successfully within its own framework, then society as a whole worked harmoniously. Over and above this, a strong and fairly successful attempt was made to create a common national bond, which would hold all these groups together, the sense of a common culture, common traditions, common heroes and saints, and a common land to the four corners of which people went on pilgrimage. This national bond was of course very different from present-day nationalism. It was weak politically but, socially and culturally, it was strong. Because of its political lack of cohesiveness it facilitated foreign conquest, because of its social strength it made recovery easy, as well as assimilation of new elements. It had so many heads that they could not be cut off, and they survived conquest and disaster. Thus caste was a group system based on services and functions. It was meant to be an all-inclusive order without any common dogma, and allowing the fullest latitude to each group. Within its wide fold there was monogamy, polygamy, and celibacy. They were all tolerated, just as other customs, beliefs, and practices were tolerated. Life was to be maintained at all levels. No minority need submit to a majority, for it could always form a separate autonomous group, the only test being, is it a distinctive group large enough to function as such? Between two groups there could be any amount of variation of race, religion, color, culture, and intellectual development. An individual was only considered as a member of a group. He could do anything he liked, so long as he did not interfere with the functioning of the group. He had no right to upset that functioning, but if he was strong enough and could gather enough supporters, it was open to him to form another group. If he could not fit in with any group, that meant that he was out of joint so far as the social activities of the world were concerned. He could then become a sannyasi who had renounced caste, every group and the world of activity, and could wander about and do what he liked. It must be remembered that while the Indian social tendency was to subordinate the individual to the claims of the group and society, religious thought and spiritual seeking have always emphasized the individual. Salvation and knowledge of the ultimate truth were open to all, to the members of every caste, high or low. This salvation or enlightenment could not be a group affair, it was highly individualistic. In the search for this salvation also there were no inflexible dogmas and all doors were supposed to lead to it. Though the group system was dominant in the organization of society, leading to caste, there has always been an individualistic tendency in India. A conflict between the two approaches is often in evidence. Partly, that individualism was the result of the religious doctrine, which laid emphasis on the individual. Social reformers who criticized or condemned the caste system were usually religious reformers, and their main argument was that the divisions of the caste system came in the way of spiritual development and that intense individualism to which religion pointed. Buddhism was a breakaway from the group caste ideal towards some kind of individualism as well as universalism. But this individualism became associated with a withdrawal from normal social activities. It offered no effective alternative social structure to caste, and so caste continued then and later. What were the main castes? If we leave out for a moment those who were considered outside the pale of caste, the untouchables, there were the Brahmins, the priests, teachers, intellectuals, the Kshatriyas or the rulers and warriors, the Vaishyas or merchants, traders, bankers, etc., and the Shudras, who were the agricultural and other workers. Probably the only closely knit and exclusive caste was that of the Brahmins. The Kshatriyas were frequently adding to their numbers both from foreign incoming elements and others in the country who rose to power and authority. The Vaishyas were chiefly traders and bankers and also engaged in a number of other professions. The main occupations of the Shudras were cultivation and domestic service. There was always a continuous process of new castes being formed as new occupations developed, and for other reasons the older castes were always trying to get up in the social scale. These processes have continued to our day. Some of the lower castes suddenly take to wearing the sacred thread, which is supposed to be reserved for the upper castes. All this really made little difference, as each caste continued to function in its own ambit and pursued its own trade or occupation. It was merely a question of prestige. Occasionally men of the lower classes, by sheer ability, attained to positions of power and authority in the state, but this was very exceptional. The organization of society being, generally speaking, non-competitive and non-acquisitive, these divisions into castes did not make as much difference as they might otherwise have done. The Brahmin at the top, proud of his intellect and learning and respected by others, seldom had much in the way of worldly possessions. The merchant, prosperous and rich, had no very high standing in society as a whole. The vast majority of the population consisted of the agriculturists. There was no landlord system, nor was there any peasant proprietorship. It is difficult to say who owned the land in law. There was nothing like the present doctrine of ownership. The cultivator had the right to till his land, and the only real question was as to the distribution of the produce of the land. The major share went to the cultivator, the king or the state took a share, usually 1/6, and every functional group in the village, which served the people in any way, had its share: the Brahmin priest and teacher, the merchant, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the cobbler, the potter, the builder, the barber, the scavenger, etc. Thus, in a sense, every group from the state to the scavenger was a shareholder in the produce. Who were the depressed classes and the untouchables? The depressed classes is a new designation applying rather vaguely to a number of castes near the bottom of the scale. There is no hard and fast line to separate them from the others. The untouchables are more definite. In North India, only a very small number, engaged in scavenging or unclean work, are considered untouchable. Fa Shen tells us that when he came, the persons who removed human feces were untouchable. In South India the numbers are much larger. How they began and grew to such numbers it is difficult to say. Probably those who were engaged in occupations considered unclean were so treated. Later landless agricultural labor may have been added. The idea of ceremonial purity has been extraordinarily strong among the Hindus. This has led to one good consequence and many bad ones. The good one is bodily cleanliness. A daily bath has always been an essential feature of a Hindu's life, including most of the depressed classes. It was from India that this habit spread to England and elsewhere. The average Hindu, and even the poorest peasant, takes some pride in his shining pots and pans. This sense of cleanliness is not scientific, and the man who bathes twice a day will unhesitatingly drink water that is unclean and full of germs. Nor is it corporate, at any rate now. The individual will keep his own hut fairly clean, but throw all the rubbish in the village street in front of his neighbor's house. The village is usually very dirty and full of garbage heaps. It is also noticeable that cleanliness is not thought of as such, but as a consequence of some religious sanction. When that religious sanction goes, there is marked deterioration in the standards of cleanliness. The evil consequence of ceremonial purity was a growth of exclusiveness, touch-me-notism, and of not eating and drinking with people of other castes. This grew to fantastic lengths unknown in any other part of the world. It led also to certain classes being considered untouchable because they had the misfortune to do some kinds of essential work, which were considered unclean. The practice of normally feeding with one's own caste people spread to all castes. It became a sign of social status, and the lower castes stuck to it even more rigidly than some of the higher ones. This practice is breaking up now among the higher castes, but it still continues among the lower castes, including the depressed classes. If interdining was taboo, much more so was intermarriage between castes. Some mixed marriages inevitably took place, but on the whole it is extraordinary how much each caste kept to itself and propagated its own kind. The continuation of racial identity through long ages is an illusion, and yet the caste system in India has to some extent managed to preserve distinctive types, especially among the higher castes. Some groups at the bottom of the scale are sometimes referred to as outside the caste groups. As a matter of fact, no group, not even the untouchables, are outside the framework of the caste system. The depressed classes and the untouchables form their own castes, and have their panchayats or caste councils for settling their own affairs. But many of them have been made to suffer cruelly by being excluded from the common life of the village. The autonomous village community and the caste system were thus two of the special features of the old Indian social structure. The third was the joint family, where all the members were joint sharers in the common property and inheritance went by survivorship. The father or some other elder was the head, but he functioned as a manager, and not as the old Roman paterfamilias. A division of property was permitted under certain circumstances, and if the parties concerned so desired. The joint property was supposed to provide for the needs of all the members of the family, workers or non-workers. Inevitably this meant a guaranteed minimum for all of them, rather than high rewards for some. It was a kind of insurance for all, including even the subnormal and the physically or mentally deficient. Thus, while there was security for all, there was a certain leveling down of the standard of service demanded as well as of the recompense given. Emphasis was not laid on personal advantage or ambition, but on that of the group, that is the family. The fact of growing up and living in a large family minimized the egocentric attitude of the child, and tended to develop an aptitude for socialization. All this is the very opposite of what happens in the highly individualistic civilization of the West and more especially of America, where personal ambition is encouraged and personal advantage is the almost universal aim, where all the plums go to the bright and pushing, and the weak, timid or second-rate go to the wall. The joint family system is rapidly breaking up in India, and individualistic attitudes are developing, leading not only to far-reaching changes in the economic background of life, but also to new problems of behavior. All the three pillars of the Indian social structure were thus based on the group, and not on the individual. The aim was social security, stability and continuance of the group, that is of society. Progress was not the aim and progress therefore had to suffer. Within each group, whether this was the village community, the particular caste, or the large joint family, there was a communal life shared together, a sense of equality, and democratic methods. Even now caste panchayats function democratically. It surprised me at one time to see the eagerness of a villager, sometimes illiterate, to serve on elected committees for political or other purposes. He soon got into the way of it, and was a helpful member whenever any question relating to his life came up, and was not easily subdued. But there was an unfortunate tendency for small groups to split up and quarrel among themselves. The democratic way was not only well known, but was a common method of functioning in social life, in local government, trade guilds, religious assemblies, etc. Caste, with all its evils, kept up the democratic habit in each group. There used to be elaborate rules of procedure, election and debate. The Marquis of Zetland has referred to some of these in writing about the early Buddhist assemblies, and it may come as a surprise to many to learn that in the assemblies of the Buddhists in India 2000 or more years ago are to be found the rudiments of our own parliamentary practice of the present day. The dignity of the assembly was preserved by the appointment of a special officer, the embryo of Mr. Speaker in the House of Commons. A second officer was appointed whose duty it was to see that when necessary a quorum was secured, the prototype of the parliamentary chief whip in our own system. A member initiating business did so in the form of a motion, which was then open to discussion. In some cases this was done once only, in others 3 times, thus anticipating the practice of Parliament in requiring that a bill be read a 3rd time before it becomes law. If discussion disclosed a difference of opinion, the matter was decided by the vote of the majority, the voting being by ballot. Footnote, quoted by G. T. Garrett in The Legacy of India, 1937, page 11. End of footnote. The old Indian social structure had thus some virtues, and indeed it could not have lasted so long without them. Behind it lay the philosophical ideal of Indian culture, the integration of man, and the stress of goodness, beauty, and truth rather than acquisitiveness. An attempt was made to prevent the joining together and concentration of honor, power, and wealth. The duties of the individual and the group were emphasized, not their rights. The Smritis, Hindu religious books, give lists of dharmas, functions and duties of various castes, but none of them contains an inventory of rights. Self-sufficiency was aimed at in the group, especially in the village, and in a different sense, in the caste. It was a closed system, allowing a certain adaptability, change, and freedom within its outer framework, but inevitably growing more and more exclusive and rigid. Progressively it lost its power to expand and tap new sources of talent. Powerful vested interests prevented any radical change, and kept education from spreading to other classes. The old superstitions, known to be such by many among the upper classes, were preserved and new ones were added to them. Not only the national economy, but thought itself became stationary, traditional, rigid, unexpansive and unprogressive. The conception and practice of caste embodied the aristocratic ideal, and was obviously opposed to democratic conceptions. It had its strong sense of noblesse oblige, provided people kept to their hereditary stations and did not challenge the established order. India's success and achievements were on the whole confined to the upper classes. Those lower down in the scale had very few chances, and their opportunities were strictly limited. These upper classes were not small limited groups but large in numbers, and there was a diffusion of power, authority and influence. Hence they carried on successfully for a very long period. But the ultimate weakness and failing of the caste system and the Indian social structure were that they degraded a mass of human beings and gave them no opportunities to get out of that condition, educationally, culturally, or economically. That degradation brought deterioration, all along the line including in its scope even the upper classes. It led to the petrification, which became a dominant feature of India's economy and life. The contrasts between this social structure and those existing elsewhere in the past were not great, but with the changes that have taken place all over the world during the past few generations, they have become far more pronounced. In the context of society today, the caste system and much that goes with it are wholly incompatible, reactionary, restrictive, and barriers to progress. There can be no equality in status and opportunity within its framework, nor can there be political democracy and much less economic democracy. Between these two conceptions, conflict is inherent, and only one of them can survive. End of Part 8, titled, The Theory and Practice of Caste, the Joint Family, of Chapter 6.